Hi everybody. This week we'll be talking about biological psychology. Biological psychology, of course, relates to most of the underlying biological, physiological differences between people, and for psychologists, how that translates to differences in thoughts, feelings, emotions, behaviors, that sort of thing. So, of course, in the beginning of this, we need to explain what biology is. So bear with me during most of this, but there'll be a couple interesting tidbits along the way. First, of course, there's the central nervous system. So we have all these tiny little things within our body, neurons that make up our nerves. So there's pieces to that, right? The major ones are the brain and the spinal cord. That's what we think about a lot. But there's also these small little units called neurons. And they're the main sort of, transmission device. As you see in the image there, the little dendrites pick up information through the synaptic gap that I'll show you in a second, and then sends, once enough of a charge is built up, if you will, sends that signal down the axon to the next, nerve cell, and then so on. And, when that builds up, it sends to the next, right? These are covered in what's called a myelin sheath to make them more insulated. So these little, sort of impulses are even controlled, like the wiring in your car, to make sure they travel fast enough to send the signal. So if you put your hand on that burner, you immediately get the reaction. And that's why certain drugs react to your body in slower and faster ways. So an epidural, for example, is a needle placed in sort of the area between your spine and your spinal cord, where it releases chemicals, and the nerve cells there are very common, and they pick up those chemical signals that we'll talk about in a minute very quickly, and then send that signal down these dendrites with the myelin sheath coating over the axon to the next nerve cell. Anyway, some of these sort of pieces of the puzzle are the synapse, the synaptic gap that I said it travels between. That's the sort of the area between the sort of end of one nerve cell and the next, right, where those signals actually get sent through the receptor sites and whatnot. And those, of course, signals are what we call neurotransmitters, right? Those neurotransmitters are the chemicals that cause the reaction, that go into those receptor sites. So things like glutamate, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine, all of these. Acetylcholine, of course, is the most exciting to say, but some of the ones you've probably heard the most are dopamine. Those sort of affect your not just things like your sort of happiness that we talk about a lot, that sort of cognitive reaction, but even your memory and movement. So some of the drugs they give you now during surgeries actually stifle your memory. So you actually don't feel pain and get knocked out, but also don't remember what happened, which is a little scary when you think about it. Anyways, all of these cause what we call action potential. When they get enough of a excitation, the action potential is the reaction to that excitation. So basically, when the axon, sends the signal, it's the strength or whatever of that signal, the reaction to that, right? So in this case, you see the little peak there being the action potential. And, in this case, it, reacts, and then it has to unreact, if you will. So the sodium opens the gates, and potassium sort of drives it back to its resting potential, we say. Almost sort of like the pistons in a car getting excited after the fuel ignites, and then sort of calming back down to a rest state, waiting for the next build up to then, snap that action potential into action. Of course, the more interesting part of this is what causes these reactions, right? So there's a few different types of those. There's drugs out there that you may or may not have heard of, things like Ritalin. Some of you may have taken some sort of stimulant, maybe just caffeine. Most of you have probably had caffeine, maybe not so many cocaine or Ritalin, but all of them basically increase activity levels, attention levels, especially in the case of Ritalin. And of course, different people, genders, BMI, all sorts of things really dictate the effects of these. So, nicotine patches, for example, different people need different levels of nicotine based on their sort of addiction potential towards the nicotine, their experience with it, and even their body weight and things like that. Most of you have also probably heard of something called alcohol. That's in the classification of depressants. So this, decreases arousal, sort of the opposite of those stimulants, right? Stimulant versus depressant. But it also affects things like judgment, reasoning, balance, a lot of physiological sort of impacts. That's why the drunk driving tests usually include, looking at someone's eyes to see a flutter of the eye gaze. Also, sort of the balance, of course, walking that line is very difficult if you're intoxicated, and it's hard to fake not being intoxicated. Although, placebo effects are there too. If you're fed fake alcohol and you think it's alcohol, it's interesting how you can actually react and think that you're drunk. Anyways, moving on, things like tranquilizers exist. So these ones like benzos and Xanax, things that reduce anxiety, but also can promote sleep. And actually, this is the classification I believe that also can affect your memory, which is interesting. And narcotics, things like heroin, the opiates, and the whole opiate addiction crisis right now is a big deal. They were, of course, initially prescribed for pain reduction. I was just prescribed a Percocet version of opiate for something as a type of an opiate after a surgery, and my medical insurance company sent me a warning saying, "Hey, these things are bad news." In my case, I sort of went off them before I even needed to, because I was too drowsy, and our online class was starting soon. Oh no! The next couple and last worth mentioning is marijuana and hallucinogens. Some people classify marijuana as a hallucinogen. But really it's a little more complex than that. It's a pain reduction. It has a lot of potential medical uses, and that's why it's being medicalized and legalized in a lot of areas due to its potential benefits and ease of sort of access and ability to dose yourself versus the difficulty with prescription drugs and the difficulties with addictions there. Hallucinogens are a little bit more on the sketchy side, if you will, although those two, especially MDMA, have been shown in marriage family therapy and other areas to sort of help by, maybe lessening someone's psychological guards or opening them up to more creative solutions, that sort of thing. But these two can be very addictive and dangerous. Anyways, getting back into the sort of the nervous system that these affect, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems that you heard of before. Basically, these sort of prepare the body for that fight or flight system or keep our body regulated, right? That sort of balance that we need that the parasympathetic system does. As this image shows, you see the different parts of the body that sort of react. So, of course, your pupil is dilated when that sympathetic system takes over. And even certain drugs will act on this and cause your pupils to dilate. Some of those harder core drugs like MDMA do this because your body is reacting in a fight or flight sort of way. But one of the interesting things also is stress can induce this. So if you are stressed all the time and your sympathetic system is activated, your digestion, as you see in the middle there, is actually slowed down. So if you're always stressed or your sympathetic system is always activated, you're not digesting food well, which can be dangerous. Anyways, the brain itself we think of as having the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. I'll show you another picture of that in a second, but they evolved over time. The brain stem and the lowest parts of the brain, the cerebellum sort of area, sort of a little bit older, whereas the cerebral cortex, what we think of as the white matter, is what evolved over time. Some people think when we started eating meat, actually. But there's also the different hemispheres, right and left, the cortex, like I said, and then the callosum that connects that left and right hemisphere that, if it's sliced, shows some really interesting outcomes. The abilities of the right and left to talk at times is very important. They even, sometimes take over for each other, as with plasticity. The idea of plasticity is that one area of the brain may take over functions, maybe in that cortex area that was relegated for vision. If that's damaged, other areas might start to detect visual stimuli, which is kind of cool. So as I said before, the sort of corpus callosum is there under the cerebral cortex at the top, which is the sort of the newest, if you will, part. And you see how that's all connected through the spinal column and the nervous system in terms of, the communication there. There's different types for the peripheral, as well as um, the voluntary versus involuntary things. So, that sympathetic and parasympathetic. You don't think about your heartbeat necessarily, but it's always regulated. And then when the sympathetic takes over, it may speed up a little bit to prepare you for a danger. Anyways, there's also some what we call subcortical areas that are interesting to know. I already mentioned the spinal cord and things like that. And the hypothalamus is an important one because it regulates a lot of our motivation. So we'll talk about that later in the semester. Things like thirst, even hunger, and like I said, motivations can be damaged, stifled, increased based on what's going on in that hypothalamus. If it has a injury or disease or something. How we know all these different parts is through a lot of imaging work that has developed over time. Some of the most basic ones, like electroencephalograms, EEGs, they look at electrical activity. Things like positron emission tomography, PETs, they look at radioactivity from chemicals that they actually inject into you. Sometimes them feel really warm, sometimes they feel really cold, but they basically go through your bloodstream and then the machine picks up the radioactive decay actually. MRIs are, looking at basically magnetic activity, magnetic resonance imaging, functional is a lot different. It sounds like the same MRI, but it's looking at the oxygen used by neurons. And when that oxygen is used, it picks up that use of oxygen to see what parts of the brain are being activated. That's kind of the important part about all of these is we want to see what's going on. So someone looks at different stimuli, the part of the brain that is responsible for vision, right, will activate, use oxygen, and then the functional MRI picks up that oxygen use. Of course, the brain is also very complex across different people, right? So in psychology, we're really concerned with human diversity across cultures, across sexes or genders. And we look at this once in a while with, the cerebral cortex, the organization size. Some people know that, women have more folds in the cerebral cortex. But there's also, studies on the dominance of which side, right versus left brain people use, and which parts of the brain are doing different things. So there's some interesting gender findings, like, for example, physical characteristics, in terms of, the image that's shown here, communication patterns, even things with emotional behavior. Of course, evolutionary psychology has looked at a lot of sex differences in mating behaviors, mating preferences, all sorts of things like that. We don't talk a lot about evolutionary psychology in here, but they kind of explain some of these cognitive differences that have evolved based on potentially needed behaviors, resource, sort of provision ideas, or other things. Societal pressures, we don't go into that a lot either, but based on the social pressures at the time, different adaptations maybe have been needed. And these then relate to different skills and cognitive abilities and potentially preferences in terms of mating and sexual behavior. Of course, more basic than even gender, there's genes and genetic information that underlies all this. One of the most interesting things about this is the gene studies where we use twins. So they study monozygotic, where they share 100% of their DNA, dizygotic, about 50, and then adopted children or children that are raised together that have no genetic similarity. These all show different patterns of similarity, with monozygotic being the most similar, basically. Of course, this is inherited. It's genetic information. Hair color and things are affected by dominant and recessive genes. Brown hair is dominant, for example, so they will be more common, right? Of course, all of this is based in the chromosomes, encoded in your DNA, right? Very complicated stuff. And these, relate to outcomes that are kind of important, right? So there's X and Y chromosomes. When there's extra chromosomes, it can create issues or problematic outcomes. What's important for psychologists, of course, is these genes are inherited, right? So the genes affect our life, right? They affect the situations we find ourselves in. They create some sort of preference for what we tend to do. So there's all sorts of things that can be an outcome of this sort of genetic information that we find. So for example, one of the things we study is the gene-environment interaction, right? This is the phenomenon where they influence our environments, work, environments, how that we choose or select versus, those sort of random experiences that we have. And they kind of, wash those out with statistical procedures, but really look at how the gene then influences, just the percent of genetic information shared influences what we see in our environment, right? So if we find ourselves in an environment where that gene is able to express itself, like extroversion, then it does. Where it doesn't express itself, or doesn't have the opportunity to express itself, then we don't get to observe it, right? So there's an interplay there between our environments and our genetic sort of encoding. Anyways, hope this makes sense, and feel free to flip back through this and look at those little images in a little bit more detail. And see you next time.